Chapter 3 of Dangerous Proposition. Julia made a K-turn for the fourth time, finally spotting an empty space between two parked cars. As she hit the gas, she glanced at the clock on her dashboard, noting it had been almost an hour since she'd split off from Abigail. With a fresh cup of coffee in her system, she was back in the game. She veered toward the parking space and pulled in, leaving the vehicle behind her in the dust. Smiling to herself, Julia straightened out the wheels of her car. She looked around, noting that clusters of 20 and 30-somethings were walking along the street. All were dolled up in tuxes, dresses, and way too much makeup. They were making their way toward the massive stone palace at the top of the hill, the Westwood Mansion. Julia glanced at her attire in the rearview mirror. Noting how casual she appeared in her tank top and jeans, she sighed. "Good one, Julia. Way to be inconspicuous." She finger-combed her wavy hair as best as she could, then stepped out of her car. God, she looked like a dandelion in the middle of a rose garden. She was the only woman in pants, and quite possibly the only one wearing clothing that covered skin past her navel. She followed the winding path that led to the gate. Much to her relief, there was no guard on duty. Considering herself lucky, she made her way toward the enormous building in the distance. It was decked out with long columns, and it stood at the top of a long set of stairs. As she approached them, she couldn't help noticing the enormous potted plants that framed the porch. Over a dozen miniature bushes were trimmed to perfection. Ceramic statues centered a gigantic water fountain. Imagining the inside of the house was probably just as ostentatious, Julia made her way toward the source of the blasting music, the backyard. As she stepped around the corner, a massive swimming pool came into her view. Several people were swimming in it. Additionally, a few hundred or so stood around it, drinking and laughing. The location of the Westwoods' extravagant home was common knowledge in North Conway. But in all the years she'd lived there, Julia had never once made a point of driving up to Cathedral Ledge for a look. Standing beside it, she was almost sorry she hadn't. The property was incredible, and it buzzed with as much nightlife as a Las Vegas casino. But she hadn't come up there to enjoy the scenery. She was going to find Colin Westwood and demand he tell her where her father was. And if he refused, she was taking the evidence she'd found, along with her theory about his after-school activities, straight to the authorities. A woman carrying a tray with champagne walked past her, and Julia snagged a glass. She helped herself to a badly needed swallow. Julia drank the bubbly liquid in hearty swallows. Doing so, it occurred to her that she had no real idea of who she was looking for. She hadn't seen Colin Westwood in over 12 years, and there was an excellent chance he'd filled out his dimples and said goodbye to his perfect build. Though it was almost a guarantee he still had his baby blues. Her temperature rose. This mess would probably be a lot easier to handle with a phone call. Settling on another strategy, Julia approached a man in the crowd who seemed like the typical North Conway playboy. He was tall, and he had tousled blonde hair. Wearing a white tuxedo jacket and pants, he appeared to have an unmistakable air of arrogance, exactly what made him the perfect candidate for what she was about to do. Mischievous green eyes scanned Julia's body from head to toe. Mr. Egotist grinned, closing in so that only a few inches of space remained between them. "That's an interesting variation on a cocktail dress." Julia perched on her toes. "You like what you see?" The man in white laid a hand on her shoulder, giving her a good whiff of the alcohol on his breath. "Very much." Julia shifted her eyes. Grateful there were so many other people in her vicinity, she said, "You're sweet. I'll bet a handsome guy like you must be friends with practically everyone here." The object of her intention shrugged. "More or less, I suppose." "Is that right? Even the legendary Colin Westwood himself?" "Not exactly." "That's a shame." Julia walked away. Her source's hand brushed against her back before she had counted to 5. "I don't know him per se, but I've been introduced to him on a few occasions. My sister knows Colin Westwood pretty well, come to think of it. She's around here somewhere. Maybe she could point him out to you, after you and I get to know each other better." "That would be wonderful." Clenching her teeth, Julia managed a tight smile. She should have suspected as much. A guy as rich as Colin Westwood probably had a whole line of bimbos frequenting his bed. Maybe he really was as handsome as he'd been when she watched him sign his name to those documents at his father's hotel. Without warning, her information source reached in and took hold of her hand. He gave it a suggestive squeeze. "You know, the gardens are beautiful this time of year. How about a tour? I get the feeling this is your first time at the Westwood estate." His probing eyes indicated all too well what he was hoping to get a viewing of. "Sorry," Julia said. "I promised my girlfriends I'd meet them here. They're out front, parking the car." Mr. Egotist nodded. As though he'd decided on a new strategy, he turned toward the crowd. His gaze wandered, settling after a moment on two men standing at the back entrance to the mansion. Shifting her eyes, Julia observed that one of the men, the shorter of the two, had wavy brown hair and freckles. The other, whose face she couldn't quite make out, had dark black hair and sharp, distinguishable eyebrows. As he crossed his arms, the shorter man stepped back, almost as if he was afraid of the other. The taller man leaned over him as though preparing to swallow him, chew him up, and spit him out in bite-sized pieces. Julia stood, dumbfounded. She realized instantly who the taller man was. She watched with bated breath as Colin Westwood snatched hold of the arm of the man he was speaking with. They didn't seem at all like friends, more like the man with the dusty brown waves was Colin's minion, and Colin was his aggravated taskmaster. Colin's magnetic blue eyes sparkled like sapphires, but they were cold with contempt. Lustrous strands of silken charcoal hair danced against his forehead. Dressed in an obviously expensive suit, he seemed very much like a man who got what he wanted, no matter what he had to do to get it. Colin had been 24 when she first saw him collecting money at his father's hotel. That made him 36 today. There was a dark quality about him that hadn't existed before. His dangerous stance indicated he called the shots, and those in his vicinity did best to just do as he asked. "That's him," the man in white said. "That's Colin Westwood, I'm sure of it." Julia nodded. Everything made sense. Her father's overturned office, the phone, the caller ID. Colin Westwood had grown from a silver spoon-fed, devastatingly handsome young man into an even more handsome older man and a criminal, and her father had gotten in his way. She watched the duo slip inside, Colin's minion going first, then Colin. She took a couple of breaths, then turned to her self-appointed tour guide. With a smile on her lips, a plan took shape in her mind. "Gosh, I'm thirsty all of a sudden. Would you mind getting me a drink?" Mr. Egotist patted the small of her back. "Not at all," he said, and disappeared into the crowd. Julia slipped her hand into her pocket to be sure her father's cell phone was still there and held her breath. Not looking back, she made a dash toward the double-glass doors. When she stood on the other side of them, she blinked several times. She had entered a very large space, which was freezing cold from the mansion's air conditioning. The enormous room had a pool table in its center. There were sofas on opposite sides of the floor, long white ones, decked with an exorbitant amount of pillows. Mahogany bookshelves lined the surrounding walls. Using her hands to navigate, Julia walked forward. Her shin banged against something cold and ceramic. Julia clasped her throbbing leg, struggling not to cry out in pain. Her shin hurt like hell. She was going to have a heck of a bruise come the morning. Spotting a door, Julia set her left foot against the ground. She made her way toward the door, watching for any objects that might be looming in front of her. Her eyes adjusted to the lighting as she entered the next room. It was smaller than the other one and almost entirely free of furniture. A streak of light reflected against the surface of a marble-topped table, the only piece of furniture in sight. Behind it, a staircase with long banisters painted an arrow to the second floor. Without taking too much time to consider whether it was totally inappropriate to go up to the second floor, Julia dashed across the carpet. She'd only made it a few feet when the sound of footsteps stopped her in her tracks. Heart-thudding, Julia sank as low to the ground as she could. She pressed her face against the floor as the lights were flicked on. A shapely older woman, wearing a black dress and apron, stepped into the doorway. "What are you doing?" the woman, obviously the maid, asked. Her voice was high-pitched and heavy with accusation. "I was looking for—" Julia sprang to her feet. "The indoor pool, the bathroom—" "Colin," she said decisively. "Oh." The maid blushed, then smiled. "Third door on the right." Thanks." Julia turned, mouth falling agape. She'd had a hunch her response might justify her being there, but she could hardly believe how easily the maid had let her go. Thankfully, the second-floor hallway was wide, and it gave her plenty of room to walk around. Grateful the stairs were behind her, she moved quickly, doing her best to keep from making too much noise. A single light shined from behind one of several closed doors. Julia hesitated. This was it, the moment of confrontation she'd been waiting for. But somehow it was that much more frightening, knowing how close she was to carrying out her plan. Assuring herself she was acting ridiculous, she took a deep breath and opened the door. The room was empty. Taking a closer look, Julia noticed the king-size bed positioned against the wall opposite her was covered in a fancy-looking royal blue comforter. The bed was perfectly made, and the armoire beside it was shut. Curious as to what else there was to see, she walked to the adjoining door. She opened it, discovering an enormous couch and a coffee table. Shutting the door behind her, Julia shook her head. Clearly no one was up there, and she'd just as well leave. Much as she was enjoying her tour of the royal living quarters, this break-in was entirely pointless. Colin had probably sent the waiter he was yelling at for more alcohol, then jumped into the hot tub with a lot of bimbos outside. She started for the door. Walking toward it, she swore she heard footsteps. She perked up her ears, catching the sound of two distinct male voices. She watched with a pounding pulse as the knob was turned from the other side. Charging to the foot of the bed, Julia lifted the ends of the comforter. In one swift motion, she tossed it into the air and pulled herself underneath. Julia held her breath. She was hot, her vision about as good as it might be on a rainy night in the woods. She could barely breathe, and the hefty down comforter on top of her was causing her to sweat profusely. Two sets of footsteps sounded against the floor. The door to the room was shut from the inside. Tonight? How in God's name do you expect me to take care of this tonight? A man, who sounded even more afraid than she was, asked. A deep-toned reply ignited goosebumps along her arms. That's your problem, not mine. Heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, Julia shifted her body. She urged herself to sink as low into the mattress as she could. I can't possibly. I'm not sure you understand. A harsh reply cut in like crackling thunder. What I understand is that if you don't rectify this situation within 24 hours, there's going to be a serious change to the status of your employment. Understand that? Silence followed. Yeah, the owner of the softer voice seemed to swallow. Sure, boss. Yeah, what? Yeah, I understand you. For your sake, you had better mean it, the man, whom Julia was certain had to be Colin Westwood, growled. The knob jangled, and the door to the room opened. Colin, presumably, spoke in a hushed voice. Keep this to yourself. I want no one to know that Dyson is missing. Julia gasped, forgetting to put a hand over her open mouth. She'd been right in coming there. Colin Westwood had kidnapped her father. She had been doing all she could to convince herself that this wasn't happening. That Colin might be a criminal, but that he couldn't possibly be responsible for her father's disappearance. She was going to be sick. And then she was going straight to the cops, getting a SWAT team to raid that mansion, and dragging Colin Westwood out of there on his billion-dollar ass. Sliding forward so she could breathe a little, Julia brought her forehead against the cool air. Colin, who seemed almost as anxious as she was, stood in the doorframe. She should have ducked, but a mix of fascination and fury kept Julia in place as he shut the door, enclosing the two of them in the room. Watching him take off his jacket, she almost forgot she wasn't invisible. He seemed deeply troubled, as though he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Taking something from the dresser, an object she couldn't quite make out, Colin clenched a fist. Failing to flick the light switch, he sat on the sofa and rubbed his tired-looking eyes. Colin stared at the object in his hand. He remained that way for several moments, deep blue irises lost in the contents of his palm. Slipping whatever it was he held into his pocket, he closed his eyes again and leaned forward, massaging his temples. He seemed so strong and confident, even in spite of how stressed out he appeared to be. Watching him, Julia imagined how his arms would feel wrapped around her body. Wondering whether his large, shapely hands had murdered her father, she stared at them. That was, until Colin turned in the direction of the bed. Heart slamming hard against her ribcage, Julia ducked beneath the covers. Footsteps thundered toward her with quick stride. Who sent you here? As though it weighed no more than a feather, Colin tore the cover from the bed. Damn it, woman, answer my question. Julia was paralyzed. She wanted to move but couldn't. She shifted sideways, almost falling off the bed. But before she could get one foot on the ground, Colin dove on top of her and locked her in place between his legs. Arms that felt like steel pillars held her in place. She forgot to move as her wrists were pinned against the mattress. "No one sent me," she exclaimed, fighting with all her might to break free. "I sent myself." "You sent yourself," he repeated in a mocking tone, as though it wasn't possible. She narrowed her gaze. "Yes." "You came here on your own?" he persisted. "There's no one you're protecting." Julia pried one tender wrist free. "Guess you'd better double-check your memorandum of enemies. Last time I checked, I'm on no one's payroll. You're lying." "Think so?" She smiled. "You must really have an onslaught of nemesis if you think a woman who can barely balance her checkbook is trying to shake you down." "Enough," he roared. "Tell me who you are and who you're working for. Assuming you cooperate, I might decide to handle you with kid gloves." "Isn't that sweet of you? I guess this is how you get all your enemies to back down. Crush them until there's no air left in their lungs. You've been warned. I'm not that easily broken." A sinister smile formed on Colin's lips. With his free hand, he snatched hold of her chin and smoothed his thumb across its surface. "There are easier ways to break a woman than by crushing the air from her lungs." Did he intend to? Julia shook her head. Just because his words were laced with sensualism, and he was staring at her lips as though they were coated in cinnamon glades, it did not mean he was going to kiss her. Or did it? A jolt of heat shot through her body as Colin lowered his mouth to hers. His lips were like velvet, dangerous, masculine. He penetrated her mouth, gliding his fingertips about her scalp. It was almost as though he was trying to take possession of her body. It was a game, Julia assured herself, fighting to steady the shaking of her knees. But as Colin's tongue prodded the entrance to her mouth, she felt herself on the brink of surrender. She hadn't kissed him back. She refused to kiss him back, and yet she found herself wanting to be closer, so much closer, and she inched her body more snugly against his. No sooner did she do so than Colin's tongue swept through her mouth like a whirlwind. It caressed hers gently, and she felt herself succumbing to its warm, sweet taste. She moved her mouth in rhythm with his, arms falling helplessly at her sides. The scent of bourbon and pine swept through her nostrils, and just for a moment she felt as though she were in a dream. She recalled the circumstances under which she'd come to be there, and her eyes shot open like cannons. Looking at her face, Colin smirked. "I felt nothing." Julia took an unsteady breath. "For a woman who has the gall to break into people's homes, I would have thought you'd put up more of a fight. Had I kept going, there's no doubt in my mind you would have surrendered completely." Julia fought to control her temper. She'd known why he'd wanted to kiss her, had known damn well why he'd wanted to kiss her, yet she'd allowed him to do it anyway. Damn him. If she could move, she'd wipe that arrogant smirk off his face. She thought quickly, an idea that seemed as good as any coming to her mind. With a grin she intended to assure him she was interested in picking up where they'd left off, she lifted her chin, tilting it to the side. With mischief in his eyes, Colin leaned in once more. Their lips touched, and Julia jerked her knee upward, striking his groin. "Little bitch," he roared, clutching his goods as he tumbled onto the mattress. Julia scrambled to her feet. Racing to the door, she turned Colin's way briefly before making a dash through. "Better luck next time, rich boy."